going to deep dive into a very stimulating discussion on a topic that I feel every one of you can relate to. Now, when we talk about DevSecOps, you might be aware that DevSecOps extends the DevOps culture of shared responsibility to also imbibe security practices. When software developers, security specialists, and IT operation teams share responsibility for an application, everyone needs to know their role and how to help each other. But the question here is DevOps and security team really working together? Or is it just in theory? To shed some more light on that, let us now call upon our panelists onto our screens to understand their take on this very interesting subject. We have with us Mr. Nishant Doshi, CEO and founder, Propello Inc., joined by Mr. Chris Harris, VP Field Engineering at Couchbase. We would also like to welcome Mr. Bala PR, Senior Director, Global Tech Platforms at Walmart, followed by Mr. Tarun Kumar, Principal Engineer, Sumo Logic. And last but not the least, we also welcome Mr. Tony Ferrelli, VP of Tech Operations at Catchpoint. A very warm welcome to all our panelists. And now, let me call upon our moderator for this session. Please welcome Dr. Niladri Chaudhary, founder and CEO of Excellentro Consulting Services. With that, we are waiting to hear our panelists. Dr. Niladri, I hand over the proceedings to you. Please carry forward.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this year's panel discussion on is developers, security, operations working together? Is that true or only in theory? I am Niladri Chaudhary, CEO of Excellentro India and Singapore, and the chief organizer for the DevOps India Summit. So thank you, everyone, for giving your time and joining in this panel discussion. And I hope to have a great session with all of your knowledge and experience. And I'm sure people will be able to get a lot of key takeaways for them. With us, I have Bala PR, Senior Director, Walmart Global Tech. I have Chris Harris, VP Field Engineering, Couchbase. I have Nishant Doshi, CEO and co-founder of Propello. I have with us Tarun Kumar, Principal Engineer, Sumo Logic, and Tony Ferrelli, VP of Operations for Catchpoint. Thanks, everyone, once again. So to start the discussion, we have seen many implementations. We have seen various state of DevOps report and state of SRE report and various reports talking about how people are implementing things in different places. We would like to understand really what is happening on the ground. And the first question that I would take is to Bala, because Bala comes from the customer side, whereas the others are coming from product and service side. So the question is, does DevOps, DevSecOps, SRE really get implemented in organizations in the right manner? What is your experience, how you are doing it in your organization?
Yeah, so Nilandri, thank you, first of all, for the great opportunity here and with a wonderful panel to speak about this topic, right? Absolutely a pleasure being here, right? At the outset, let me say that I have seen this work in my organization and continuing to mature that basis, right? I think various pieces of DevOps and the DevSecOps and the SRE journey, right? But to shorten or probably more coming out explicitly, right? I think if we take our lifecycle journey and split it into various boxes, right? I think which is plan, design, build, test, and deploy run phases, right? I think there are significant amount of complexities in each of these phases, as we all know, right? Induced by various tools, frameworks, processes, and people, right? But one of the things which I have seen significantly work better for us is all around the build, test, and deploy run phases. Significantly, the maturity is really high, right? I think if you really look at our organization, both SRE space and the DevOps space, right, I think continues to push the automation agenda forward and continues to run the operational excellence teams, right, significantly on the build, test, and deploy run phases, right? The feedback loops, right? I think we need to definitely strengthen, right? I think that continues to be a challenge, but we are continuing that maturing phase. But largely, I have seen in simple terms, I have seen it work fairly well, right? And clearly, the stronger gating processes and ensuring that we put compliant code to work, right, in our key customer-facing environments, right, is a prime priority, and that's been the focus area for us as well, right? But I've seen it fairly working well, and we are continuing to mature that journey.
Okay, thanks, Bala. So let me go to Nishant first after Bala. And I will ask the same question. What is your experience with your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for having us. So I have a little bit of a mixed bag experience, right? Both as a practitioner in my prior life, as a VP of engineering at Palo Alto Networks, and now with Propello, where we're helping a lot of different companies and teams get better insights and get a sort of improve productivity and efficiency, especially DevOps and engineering teams. So we work with a lot of customers, and I've seen this, in most companies. The reason they work with Propello or a tool like Propello is actually because they have challenges, and there are different layers of these challenges. As if you're one team, you may be able to kind of get some processes orchestrated and sort of streamlined, but as I say, you're always one team away or one acquisition away from chaos. And we see this quite regularly, right? So we see different companies or within teams within different companies operate slightly differently, slightly different sort of leadership models, slightly different processes, even different tool sets. And in order to kind of make all of this work, it really, a lot of companies sort of choose two paths. One is a normalization path, or a let's normalize all our tools, let's converge, and that's almost always I've seen it to fail. It's more like, how do you sort of like take the tools you have and make them work better, especially from a process point of view. And that requires a lot of like insights, that requires understanding where you can automate certain things, where can you do better handoffs, where are the bottlenecks. And that's something that we see successful companies do. We don't see as, we do see a lot of companies that have challenges where they've sort of siloed to some extent. And that's sort of like each silo has to get optimized. And then again, as you bring in more complexity, more teams, that sort of starts to fall apart. So that's our experience. Almost every company that we work with, whether it's mid or large or even small companies, we see this again and again, that they are having challenges just managing DevOps, and you add more stuff, it becomes even more sort of like DevSecOps, SRE, it becomes even more challenging.
Sure. Thanks, Nishant. So I'll go to next to Tarun and then to Tony, because you are providing a kind of observability tool. And I would like to also understand that while you are implementing those tools in your customers, where customers are working with, as Nishant said, with various silos, if you would like to say, how do you manage, or how does your tool help in bringing them together, breaking the silos? So I'll go with Tarun first and then Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Niladri. I think that's a great question. So traditionally, what we have seen is companies used to have three different functions. Developers managing development lifecycle. Then you used to have operations doing operation side of things. And then security that would come in at the last stage, and they would try to look at things from security point of view. Right, and it created lots of silos traditionally. Security team used to be a drag on the releases, right? They used to be a department of no, and as a result, everybody would basically marginalize them over time. I think things have been changing with time. Now, I think all of these three functions are coming together, and with time, we are seeing more and more of that happening in industry as well as in our customer base. Right. So now, what happens is companies basically try to bring that culture of DevSecOps from day one. They make sure that all functions work together. They set up right processes, right tools, right infrastructure, as well as right framework to navigate into that journey. And products like us at Sumo Logic, basically we serve both types of customers, right? We serve customers who want to focus on observability. We serve customers who want to focus on security. And the way I think we suggest our customers to think about this is you should think about your application lifecycle end to end and not think in terms of silos, right? Think about what value do you want to provide to customers and make sure that from day one, you bring all the functions together and think about security, operations, development at each stage. And it is responsibility of everyone in the project to make sure that everything is being done together and nothing happens in waterfall manner.
Sure. Thanks, Tarun. So, Tony, what's your experience?
So there's no magic bullet, right? So there's no magic tool. There's no magic process. There's no magic framework that you can implement to start these practices in your company, right? It requires time and it requires culture shifts, right? Because you're dealing with people here, right? So people kind of get ingrained in the processes that they've been doing for years and they go, but it works for me. And I totally agree. I think we still see silos between operations, security, and developers. Some companies have started to break down those walls, right? Which I think is fantastic. One of the things that we do, and I know Sumo does, is what we try to do is we try to build a framework so these teams can start to communicate in the same languages with each other, right? Because I think they all talk differently, right? And they care about different things. Network guys care about pings and trace routes. Developers, care about the speed, the way a tool, performs, right? All these things, and what we try to do is we try to give them the overall global picture as to what's happening, especially from a user perspective. So this way, the network guys can communicate with the developers, and maybe not on the security side so much for what we do, but developers, operations people, and SREs, they all have to work together actually to build a really good application now, especially with all the complexities that are coming into things now. There's so many microservices out there. Applications are broken down into tinier and tinier bits, which make it harder to understand how the overall system performs, right? So you have to have people talking in a similar language to be able to communicate what's happening, right? And for them to be able to troubleshoot and fix problems. So that's one of the things that we try to do is help them get the whole picture, right? Rather than just pieces.
Thanks, Tony. We'll come to Chris. Chris is from a database side, and that's very important. And I would like to understand that when you are implementing or helping customers on the database side, how do you really are able to work with the security and operations?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me onto the panel. It's a great pleasure to be here. You're absolutely right. So as Couchbase, we run mission critical database systems for people in the cloud. And we're talking about high performance database systems that need to respond within less than a second, right? Because we're talking about tier 0, tier 1 type applications that hosted and managed by Couchbase in the cloud. So to do that, you obviously have to think about having a high performing SRE organization, DevOps organization, a lot of automation that goes into that, because running a database doesn't live in isolation. I think one of the other speakers also talked about this. It's about looking at the entire application as a whole, and even not just the microservice. Because if you look at coming from kind of our side of the house, if you're looking for high performance databases, you're only as fast as your slowest player. So you've got to therefore have automation at the infrastructure level to be able to deal with peaks and elastic kind of demand, such as, Black Friday, Cyber Monday type activities, not just the database, but the underlying infrastructure. You have to have the microservices architecture built into the database itself. But then you also have to work from a DevOps, from an SRE perspective, with the developers building applications. Because if your data model isn't right, or your query is not performing, or your index strategy isn't right, doesn't really have how fast your database is or how fast your infrastructure is, and nothing's going to perform the way that you want it to perform. These things have to be highly integrated and a lot of collaboration between the different roles. And ultimately, I'm talking about data. So I'm sure people on this call would understand that's the crown jewels to many of our end customers. So then you put on security on top of that. But then that's not just about security features and functions. It's about compliance and HIPAA and PCI. And you've got to totally these teams have to work hand by hand with one another inside Couchbase because we're hosting the platform, but also with the system integrator, with the customers team, because any player that is not performing or is not integrated will have a knock-on effect across the entire application estate.
Great. Thanks. So I noted down a couple of things, and I look at the first point one of the points that I heard is about silos, and the other is about creation of value. And I see that all of you are talking about a holistic kind of an approach. The question here is, let us take a little bit away from the technology and move towards a process a little bit. So I will start with Nishant first now. And my question is that we see a lot of frameworks, as in the ITIL kind of frameworks, SAFe, Agile, Scrum, those kind of frameworks. And what we see is that different initiatives of different frameworks are being conducted at the same time in the same organization. However, to me, the thought is that all those are looking at creation of value. I would like to understand from Nishant first as to what I call as the framework silos. The frameworks itself are creating the silos within the organization. And how do you see, in your experience, that whether these frameworks are allowing people to achieve what we were just talking about, creating the value, looking at it holistically, or they are actually creating the silo and creating a bigger challenge in the scenario?
So that's a great question. So let me start by saying first, I'll sort of like broadly talk about three things, right? So first thing is, I do feel it's great that, there's a lot of tooling, but that gets some of this data, system data especially, together. But it's really, where I've seen companies do well, both in my experience and what I see in my customers, is really about the process, right? As an example, you can get all your security vulnerabilities in one place, but where do you store them? How do you ticket them? How do you govern them? Whether it's too much data, too less data, all of these things are processes. And it doesn't matter if it's in one database, but somebody has to act upon it, and somebody has to remind people, and somebody has to do certain processes, right? The way I look at it is, so it's really about the processes, especially within the organization, whether it's DevOps and SRE, or sort of like outside, whether it's DevOps and compliance and DevOps and security, or vice versa, right? So it's really about how do you sort of have all of these processes work together? And in my experience, companies are not that great at sort of process adoption and especially process governance. It becomes really challenging, especially as you get bigger. You have different sort of silos, and the silos also have different sort of incentives. It becomes really, hard to kind of align everything and keep moving it. Now, the second point I'm going to raise is there are frameworks, and these frameworks sometimes are not overlapping, right? For example, a Scrum process does not talk about how change management is done. It may talk in principle of going fast, but it's more about the planning aspects of it. So there might be some overlaps, but at the same time, frameworks are great. And to me, I've seen success when people are not so religious about frameworks. They take it in spirit and they try to kind of adapt it to what they do, versus sort of saying we should do story pointing because that's what Scrum says, or we should do something else, right? It's really about the spirit, and then you kind of how much can you adopt, how much makes sense for your business. And then how do you sort of make sure that there are some processes, they may not be in any framework. There might be, for example, you have supply chain security coming up, and I don't think there is a framework right now around supply chain, as an example, or there might be some emerging frameworks around supply chain. And I was in this whole, revolution around, cloud security, posture management, and initially there was no framework. So it's really about sort of like, how do you sort of understand what's going on and sort of adapt and also come up with your own processes? And that's where I've seen companies really not do a great job, is really come up with their own processes and measure these processes, understand where the handoffs are happening, and sort of have a continuous loop of process improvement. And that's what sort of gets, success. So to me, it's really about the last point is like, it's really about getting not just system data, but also understanding people and process data, and sort of having a governance layer, having an intelligence layer on top of that, and sort of like, being always ready to kind of innovate around that area.
Thanks, Nishant. Couple of points gave me some ideas, which most probably I will come out with some new questions as I go forward. So I'll come to Bala on this and would like to understand from your experience point of view, how do you see as the framework silos, and how are you handling that in your organization?
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I almost agree with Nishant, right, in terms of comments, right? I think so. But one of the things which probably we need to slightly term differently. I don't think framework needs to be definitely branded as a silo, right? I think there are various frameworks at play, right? I think in various organizations to varying degrees of maturity, right? One of the things which we have seen within our organization is, what does frameworks deliver to us, right? I think frameworks help us go deeper, right? I think so, deeper into the engineering excellence side of things, right? That's where probably frameworks play the game, right? I think so. We see significant whether it's the enterprise architecture side of things, or even the whatever we call as the SAFe and the Scrum framework, right? I think one of the things which gives us is deeper patterns emerging out of the various tech teams, right, or tech engineering teams, right? I think so that patterns, right, we need to pick up those patterns, and can we that bring a horizontal view of it, right? I think so that can we take the value by bringing it horizontally across, right, across various segments. It could be various markets, it could be any of those things, right? I think, can we take it horizontally to deliver value, right? I think that is where probably the value from that is coming through, right? I think so that is our view, right, at the moment, because one clearly focuses, the frameworks will continue to focus at the engineering excellence side of things, right? How do we continue to build the upstream pressure on development principles, right, to make sure that that gets refined. And the other horizontal bit will give us the operational excellence themes, right, largely around cost control is a big one for us, right? I think, how do we continue to do the cost control with better operational principles, and clearly, right, with large security vulnerabilities coming through, right, every month, right? How do we make sure that we expose ourselves minimally, right, and make sure that the tech debt and gating process gets stronger, right? I think so. The patterns coming out of the frameworks can be adopted horizontally is something which we clearly look out for, right? I think in terms of value from this.
Thanks, Bala. So I'll come to Chris, and actually Chris, Tony, and Tarun, because you are all coming from the product background. And I would like to understand from you that how does your products help in breaking these process framework silos? Or does it even do it?
So the first thing I always do with every client that I work with, and we work with many, big names across the world for different applications, is the first thing you have to ask is, what is the ultimate goal of what they're trying to do? Before you get into the frameworks, don't let the framework dictate what you do first. You got to take a step back, and what are the goals of the organization? What's the goals of the program? What's the goals of the project? And then understanding, okay, with that, what are what is the right process and what's the right frameworks that map into that. Because there's a lot of people who will just say, hey, I want to use this framework, or I want to use this methodology, or whatever it is. And you say, well, why do you want to use that? Well, that's because it's cool. Well, that's not an answer that I'm really interested in, right? Or everyone else is doing it. Well, again, go back to the original question, is what is right for this organization? You have to go down that path. And then you start looking about how, because as I mentioned before, the database doesn't live in isolation. You have to work with everybody else in the process. And then it's about, okay, I take a simple one, right? If we're going to map has been put out that we were doing agile, then I, as Couchbase, the SRE organization, the way in which we're operating needs to fit in to that framework that the rest of the project or program team is using. If I've got one team that's doing agile and another team is doing a completely different methodology, you're just going to get chaos, right? And it's not about one being better than the other. It's all about having consistency. And the textbook, I think, is a good starting point, but people do trip up. And I think some of the earlier speakers mentioned, if you just follow it to the letter, well, that was never what it was designed for, right? It was designed in the context where you work. And skills, and if you've never done a methodology before, if you've never done a framework before, definitely the textbook way of reading up and understanding what the principles of it was about is a good place to start. But then you have to look at how does that fit into my organization, the team and program and projects that I'm working in. That's our approach.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. Let's go to
I was
Tony.
going to say, I definitely agree with that, right? Like these are guideposts, right? So these are principles and ideas that you have to adapt to your organization, right? It's not something that you can just pick it up and plop it into place and it's going to work. And I think Nishant made the point before, right? It's all about the processes that you put in place, right? And measure those things to make sure that they're actually adding value to the organization, right? And having the discipline to say, to throw out a process if it's not working, right? So you can't just adopt these things wholesale. You have to bring them in. There has to be some forethought, and you have to be pragmatic about it and adapt it to your organization, right? The way it works, the way you think it should work, right? And then measure it to see if what you did actually made a difference or not, right? So it's all about measuring those things. Like I said, I think I talked about our tool before. Our tool is about measuring things from that outside perspective, right? So then you can then have conversations between the different teams, right? Like a lot of applications have a lot of localization now, right? So geolocation is important, right? So you want to make sure as a network person that you understand what those things are to make sure, and a systems person to make sure that the application is going to the right place, right? Am I serving Indonesian content from my servers when that user is coming from Indonesia, right? Like all that stuff becomes super important and it gets super granular. So it's important that every step in that chain understands what's important, right? And how to measure it and how do you monitor it, right? So, the whole point of frameworks, it's great, but like it's like a tiny step in the process.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Tarun, what is your experience?
Yeah, I totally agree with Tony and Chris. I think the way I would think about this is, see, at the end of the day, every company wants to provide a reliable and secure experience to their customers, right? And to do that, it's not just about making sure that you do development and operations. It's you have to think about it holistically. Let's take an example, right? Let's say if you have DDoS attack, not only it affects your security, it affects your operations also. Right. So lines are converging so much with time that in some cases, it's very hard to differentiate whether it is security issue or operations issue. In most cases, it is both of them. Right. Let me give another example. Let's say if some malicious user does some activity, right, and you audit log it, right, it can be a security concern also, and it can be operation issue also. Right. So you would want to look at it from both angles and make sure that you come up with tools, processes, and frameworks so that they apply to both of them. Things like audit logs, things like automation, things like continuous integration and delivery, they apply to all three domains, right? And I think we basically recommend customers to think about what kind of experience do you want to provide to customers and what it would take to achieve it, right? And then you bring that mindset from day one. Security is everybody's responsibility, and it's not responsibility of single function, right? I think if I have to draw a parallel with e-commerce applications, we use e-commerce applications all the time. Let's say if you order, let's say a large number of items from any vendor, any e-commerce application, they would wrap each item individually, right? Just to make sure that each item is protected and secure. And then they would bundle it together also so that there's additional level of security. I think each function has to work in a similar way, where they make sure at each step of the journey, they think about how do we make sure that we provide reliable experience with security, and it does not become afterthought, right? And once you have a product that takes care of all these things at each stage, I think it gets easier to provide much better experience to your customers.
Thanks, Tarun. I think you got into the next question also, but let's continue with this question. So let me just, based on whatever you have all have said, let me start again with Tony this time. And Tony, the question here is 2-3 points which came up. One was about cost control that Bala talked about. And I think there was point about consistency, and there was point about the importance of process. Now, based on that, my question here is that while cost is important, I know, but is cost the primary factor in deciding things? Or the reason being that today we are talking about that value delivery that initially Nishant, I think, had mentioned. So with the value delivery, is cost really a critical factor? And now that we are talking about the framework silo, we are talking about the tools, what should be the approach to be taken, what you see in successful organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a balancing act, right? Because, cost is always a driving factor, right? Because, we're in this business to make money, to add value to our customers, and do it in a way that improves our margins, right? Like, this is the business, right? This is capitalism. But like, you don't want that reputation hit if you have a very unreliable product, because then people won't come to you, right? They won't come to you to help solve their problems for them, right? Or solve a problem that they're having. So, I think cost is always a factor, but you have to balance that out with the reliability, predictability, supportability, usability of the product that you're putting out there, right? So it's a factor that you have to take into account, but it's never the factor, right? It just can't be, not in the world that we live in today, right? Outages matter, seconds matter, milliseconds matter, right? You're seeing a big push in the industry now for Mac, right? So edge compute, it's kind of throwing things up in the air and making things more complicated, right? But you're not doing that because of cost, right? You're doing that because you're trying to deliver a more reliable product to your customer, right? So you're going to spend those extra dollars if it makes sense for your application, that you have to be fast, right? That you have to be really quick about it. That you need response times in the milliseconds rather than in the seconds, right? So I think it's never the primary factor. It's always, but it is a factor that you always have to take into account, because you don't want to build something that costs more than the money that you make, right? Like, that's just silly. You're not going to be in business very long. Although, you see a lot of companies out there, they'll take that risk in the beginning, but over time, your product has to have a margin that gives you a livable salary, right? And can pay your employees and make the company successful. Otherwise, you're not going to last long. So,
sure. Thanks, Tony. I will come to Nishant now. And my question is that, do you think that if we consistently deliver value, would it not also help in achieving our cost control?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, it depends on what lens you're looking at. Um, I think there's a micro aspect to it. As a macro, it really depends on your business goals, right? So ultimately, it's about unit economics. It's about sort of your business goals, whether you want to, you know, go aggressive because it's time to market and then win the market and then sort of like control cost, or whether you want to do the latter, whether you want to go slow, whether you're going to fast. Like it really depends on how you want to play that chess game, right? And that's what most companies end up doing, right? Also think the second thing is when you think about when it cost itself, there's different facets of cost. Most people think of cloud cost as the only facet. There's a lot of other facets that we see companies dealing with, right? Whether it's about software capitalization, whether you want to do it or not do it, whether it's about sort of like hiring, and that's your biggest sort of cost, to be honest with you, in most companies, right? Whether they're getting efficiency out of like the people that they've hired, whether you should hire a new contractor or not. These are the areas that any engineering leader, any CIO, any CEO are probably be looking at, right? It's like, where are my resources getting spent? Are they wisely spent? What is my, from a system perspective, is that sort of like making sense or not? Do I expand to EU or don't expand to EU right now? All these are factors that I think, so it's not a generic, silver bullet answer. It's really about sort of like, measuring the value chain, essentially every day, every month, understanding what the levers are and adjusting those levers accordingly. And that's where most companies I've seen not do a great job or have challenges, if they even have intention of doing it, is really becoming a little more data oriented. And that's what we're helping companies with, is really taking not just like when, looking at system data and saying like, hey, this server and these uptimes are up and down, or, I have 99.999%, but then, there are other aspects that you also need to measure and understand, cost being one of them. And the third area is just kind of predicting cost or forecasting is an area that is, I think, very, I would say, nascent for most companies, especially as you go down market. It's just to kind of predict what your cloud cost, as an example, is going to be, because it depends on the business, right? I mean, it really depends on how many contracts you're going to sign this year, and that's not a perfect science. Just like sales forecasting is not a perfect science, that equally translates into the cloud cost forecasting, and that sort of also trips up a lot of companies. So yeah, three broad aspects of cost. I don't think it's if you deliver value, you can control costs is a simple sort of answer there.
Great. So I'll go back to Bala on the question here. And the question that I would like to ask is, while cost, as we see, everybody says that is important for any organization because they are there to make profits. But we have also seen that looking only at cost, or rather focusing too much on cost, also creates people to take decisions which might not be very good for the long run or in the right perspective. And as Tony just now mentioned about the balance between the cost and also the outage and other things that we need to balance, the stability, the reliability of the systems. What do you think? How do you balance between the two? I'll give you an example. Like I've seen people looking at, if I come from a background of service provider, system integrator. Okay. So what I've seen is that when I have to pitch in for a project and my finance guy will say that you have to have this percentage of profitability, and to make sure that happens, I have like one experienced guy and I'm trying to push three inexperienced people just to fit in that cost structure. But does it really deliver value? Is it really saving costs? Number one. Number two, today IT is no longer a cost center. IT is business. So is it a IT decision to make about cost, or is it a decision to make from the point of view of, hey, if I do not do these things, if I am not able to provide these features, the stability, my competitors are going to do it, and anyway I'll be killed. How do you balance that?
Yeah, so just was on mute, right? So great discussion around this, right? But I think in my mind, I think cost is always going to be a driving force, right? I think it is not just about cloud spend, right? I think it is about, right, purely looking at eliminating waste, right? I think so wherever we are, right? I think if you go around and ask the top CIOs, right, in terms of, right, are we clearly utilizing the cloud in a finely cut manner, right, to the right levels, right? I think you may get various sets of answer, but I don't think anybody would sign in blood that it is as it should be, right? I think so. We know that there is quite an area of opportunities there, right? So one of the things which SREs bring into play, right, I think is around, right, is putting the pressure back on our dev streams, right, to continuously optimize, right, so that we don't throw capacity to hide poor quality code, right? I think this has been always a challenge, right? I think where there has to be a driving force, right? I think you have a finite capacity, right? You have a finite cost. You have to run it, right? To clearly look at the margins, right? Because everybody runs a business, and that's where the SREs play a big game, right? In my mind, right? I think the operational cost becomes, right, I think, a driving force for maintaining the dev pressure, right? I think the pressure has to be pushed upstream, right? I think to ensure that we do automation as far as possible, we push code which is compliant and not suboptimal, right? I think which is performance tested for whether it is response times or throughputs or whatever it is, right? So those metrics are important as well, right? I think so we need to, the cost will drive upstream pressure, right? The value, definitely, there are quite a bit of intangibles there. Reliability, we can do chaos testing, we can do various types of performance testing, backend testing, all that can happen, right? But I think one driving force will be cost, which will put pressure on our dev streams, right? I think that's my view, and hopefully some of the panelists would agree to that. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Mara. So let's go to Chris. And Chris, I will go to the next point about security. I think Tarun already had touched a little bit on that. And I would like to understand from you that how do you, from the database side of things, how do you work with security SMEs in the value stream?
How do we work with them? Literally side by side. You cannot run a operational high performance tier 0, tier 1 application without having alignment with security. It's just a non-starter, right? So therefore, you have to, and the trick is not to leave security to the end. If you left security to the very end, then you're basically surprising people, and that's a mistake. You can go through the whole process. You could go through your whole design, and then try to even build an application, and then say, "Hey, security team, can you put this in production?" You're just going to get red flags everywhere, and the later you leave it, the harder they're going to push back. If you engage with the security team, bring them into your program, sit with them side by side from the very beginning, life becomes easy, is my experience. People who don't do that is where you get into difficulties. I actually don't believe that the security team are the stoppers of programs and will shut you down. They only do that if you surprise them, and they do that because you didn't engage with them. That would be how my thoughts on how you engage with the security team.
Sure, thanks. So Tarun, in your experience, how do you people work with security teams of your customers?
Yeah. So I think basically, let's say if customers want to deploy a new application, right? One thing that we suggest to them is along the lines of what Chris is saying, which is involve your security team as soon as possible. I think the ideal stage would be at requirement stage, so that everybody gets to be on the same page right when project is being kicked off. Right. And then let's say when you design it, you make sure that everybody understands what the design is and what kind of changes we need to make so that there are no surprises later on. Right. And then once everybody is on same page, you set a set of principles and guidelines so that there are no conflicts later on. Right. And I think once that is agreed upon, after that, it's matter of execution and making sure that folks are working together and have coherent way of making progress. That after that is done, then there are less chances of you running into surprises. And then at every stage, you make sure that you are looking at it from security point of view, right? Let's say if let's say you deliver some milestone of a project, you involve your app security folks and let them do some, let's say, some type of testing. Let's say they want to do XSS testing, or let's say they want to do DDoS testing, or they want to look at if you are logging, let's say, customer data, PII data, PCI data, or any other type of vulnerability testing they want to do, right? You get that feedback immediately. You apply that feedback loop, incorporate that, and then you course correct if any adjustments are needed, right? And because you are constantly in that feedback loop cycle, you get value out of those feedbacks very, very immediately, right? And then if at all you have to make any major changes, because you are making those changes at the early stage, you can, I think, figure out what impact it is going to have on your timelines, on your deliverables, as well as your costs, right? So I think that's what we recommend to our customers, to follow this process from day one and apply that security mindset from day one end to end.
Thanks, Tarun. Let's go to Chris again. And now we will have the question, which is, what are the challenges that you face in really implementing, doing things in the right way with the DevSecOps, SRE, VSM kind of approach?
I think the first thing that you do is you have to make sure that there's consistency in terms of even vocabulary. What are we trying? What are we trying to do? What are our goals? But you've almost sort of seen it here. You know, people will use things like framework or value. You're like, what exactly do you mean, right? So that everybody is using the same methodology and the same, they may be using the same words, but there's a common understanding of what these words mean, right? So that is a majority of challenges in programs is about, it's not necessarily purely technology. A lot of it is people, and that's skills. And I believe that the majority of the time, every member of the team is working with positive intent. They in their mind, believe they're trying to do the right thing. If you can come into a conversation with appreciation, they might not all have to start at the same starting point, but everybody has to get onto the same page at the end. And there has to be leadership to make decisions to get there. And then if you can get that in place, and then you can bring together the project teams, engage them in the consistent framework, have that collaboration, you can reuse the skills that you've already got. You, by definition, take out a huge amount of risk out of your project implementation. It's not going to say there's no challenges, but that's the core challenges that almost every program that I work on with is, it's really about collaboration, people, alignment.
Thanks, Chris. To Tony?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Chris said, right? It's about having a common vocabulary, having well-publicized processes, right, on how you're going to approach a problem across teams, having some flexibility with that, right? You know, because some teams have different concerns and different priorities. So understanding that, and then there has to be, you know, you have to have solid leadership, right? So common leadership that's helping push that agenda, right? Push that story. That here's the way we're going to do things. Here's the process. Here's kind of the flow of the way things are going to go across teams. But then allowing those teams to have a certain amount of flexibility on how they go and implement, right? As long as the end result is there, that's the most important piece. But like you want to have transportability right between teams. So a team member moves from team A to team B, they know roughly that the process is going to be the same, right? And you're going to follow that through.
Thanks, Tony. Tarun?
No worries.
Yeah, I think I agree with these folks completely. I think basically building the right culture in such cases is very important. And I think once it is part of culture, it becomes scalable automatically, right? If in every project you're reinventing the wheel and you're realigning the folks and creating best practices, I think that's when it creates confusion and it is no longer scalable, right? So I think once it becomes part of your culture and once I think it becomes a part of your values, then things automatically happen.
Thanks. Nishant?
I have a slightly different point of view. I've worked both in security teams and straddled between security and engineering. So sort of seen both sides of the house. First of all, my belief is that sort of consistency of processes is generally a pipe dream, or I've seen it as a pipe dream in most companies, especially the larger ones, because it's easy to say let's be consistent, but like when you have acquisitions going on, new teams, it's generally a moving target. So it's really hard for most companies to kind of get to they might have a common vocabulary and a general sort of process that might be consistent, but it's hard to kind of get always get everyone on the same page, and that's what most companies are sort of challenged with. And as sort of like Tony mentioned, there might be sort of business use cases that are sort of slightly different, so there has to be that flexibility. I completely agree with you on that. As far as like the principle of DevSecOps and shift left, or I'll use some hype words here. It's great to say like, hey, let's do a threat model, and security should be involved in a, get go, and let's, have, but it's very difficult because if you think about a general company or your security team, and especially AppSec team, people who are sort of like even looking at things like application and product security, they might be like in the teams or even like lower than that, right? In like maybe less than 10 people. You're shipping 5,000 stories, 2,000 stories across the company every week, every 2 weeks. It's not practical for like, it's great to say, we recommend our customers to do this, or we recommend these people to do that. But it's very hard for teams being on both sides to actually go implement and look at 2,000 stories or even prioritize or even begin to prioritize what they should look at. And so, I mean, if you look at most of the shift left principles, the threat modeling has gone out of the window for most companies. They don't do that anymore. I'm not seeing that, though it's a great process. I just don't see that happening very often, right? Similarly, like, it's more like now getting to a point where it's more form-based, more question and answer based. And only for certain things there is sort of like, there might be some reviews and things like that. And that's what, most companies are doing. There might be some companies who are sort of overshooting that and actually doing it in a better way. But it's been a hard, challenging route for most companies. And again, this is where you need a lot of an intelligence layer that comes on top of that to kind of really make sure to understand what is the priority, are people doing what they're saying they're doing, and then sort of bubble up, things that should be done more urgently than others. And that's where I see, great companies make that difference versus sort of like mandating a process, but then not having the scale to kind of like go follow through that process. And that's what I see. And that's why we have an industry, and that's why you have 3,000 vendors at RSA or Black Hat this year, because they're all trying to solve the same problem. And if it was a solved problem, that they would not be 3,000 companies that are trying to solve shift left problems.
Thanks, Nishant. Bala, your thoughts on this?
I agree with most of the comments here. And one of the things which I would reiterate is around the leadership commit, right? I think which was brought in, right? I think how do we bring together a shared success criteria or a shared goal commit, right, across these teams, right, to have a single focused objective which both teams will go after, right? I think that clearly needs a significant leadership commit there, right? I think so. That's one thing. And more on the transactional side of things, right? I think we have seen continuous maturing of processes in terms of usage of standard libraries, blueprints, and all that stuff at the dev cycle, and probably strengthening of the vulnerability gates during the deploy and the run phase, right? I think so that continues to mature, right? I think that those are existing strands of engagement between various security teams and the dev teams that needs to be strengthened further. But clearly, leadership commit is one big thing to identify a shared purpose and a shared commit, right? I think that I will leave it there.
Thanks. So I have two more questions. One is about, can you all give me at least a couple of examples of smaller organizations implementing DevSecOps, SRE, value stream management in the right way? Because typically what people comments is that, oh, this is for Google and Facebook. We are not Google and Facebook. It's not for us. So I would like to really understand that, is it for others also? And I will go first with Tarun.
Yeah, I think at some of the smaller organizations, it sort of becomes a forced thing because sometimes companies don't have resources to hire dedicated people for each function. And I think in some cases it works wonders for them, right? Because they have, let's say, a same set of people who are doing development, operations, as well as security. And then in some cases they have to train those folks so that they are able to look at it horizontally. But then because I think those folks have been thinking about it end to end, they basically, I think, bring that mindset in the company where all the processes, all the tooling, all the infrastructure is being set up in a way that every part of it is being considered. Right? I've seen a couple of examples of that in our customer base, and that works really well for them. Versus at some of the bigger companies, because they tend to have resources, they tend to have dedicated teams and folks looking at it, which is great as well, because you want depth and you want folks who bring a lot of expertise. But then you have to provide them an environment where they come together, share learnings at a forum, and make sure that they go back to their specific areas and teams and projects and apply it, right? So I think in small and medium companies, in some cases, it is forced on them, versus in some cases, companies make that choice where they are going to set up that culture where same set of folks do similar things. Or if they have dedicated folks, they work so closely with each other that I think there are no silos at all.
Thanks. So Tony, with respect to this scenario of how doing things better, what is your experience in having this in smaller organizations?
So I've got to see this firsthand, right? So I spent 12 years at Google. Now I've been at Catchpoint for 2.5 years, and I run the ops team, and I actually run an SRE team. So now I went from Google scale to Catchpoint scale, which we're about a 350 person company, right? So it's small, right? It's a small group of people. So you really have to pick and choose your battles, right? And start small. Take small steps, right? You're not going to make big change overnight and change a culture overnight, right? So one of the things we're doing to introduce SRE concepts and even security concepts, and push it to the left, push it into the development process, is we started a PRR process, a production readiness review, right? Where any application that's going to hit production, or actually hit before production, right, the staging or QA, right, has to go through this review process where we talk about security, where we talk about key metrics, right? How they're going to be measured, how are we going to automate, what the infrastructure needs to look like to support it at scale, right? So we're having those conversations now with development teams. And that's like, so I don't have enough SREs to embed them in every dev team, right? So I kind of have to pick and choose our battles, right? About how are we going to cover this specific app, this specific system? How are we going to cover it from an SRE point of view, an automation point of view? How are we going to measure things? How are we going to know if we're successful or not, right? And then also on the security side of things, how are we going to make sure that, what's the patch cycles going to be? What libraries are you using? How often do we update them? How do we know that we're keeping them updated, right? We're having those conversations earlier in the process now, right? so we can hopefully improve over time, right? Nobody's perfect. In small companies, it's really hard to do some of these things and adopt all these principles at once. So, my suggestion always is start small, pick something. To me, the PRR process is a really, really good process to have, because before you let something out into the wild, you're actually putting some forethought into it before it goes out, right? And you're making sure you have the right monitoring in place, and you're making sure you have the right, you've looked at the system at least at a high level from a security perspective. And then how are you gonna test it in the future? Like, what tests are you gonna run to make sure that it stays secure? And then we balance things out. Sometimes they'll bring in an external pen tester to work on something for us. And then my security guys actually run internal pen tests, every month, every quarter, right? And we pick different systems, right? So it's about finding that balance, right, to do it, and not skip it, right? Because it really does help, right? Like, automation saves you people, right? I'd much rather have an automated response to an alert than have a human have to log in to go do something. Because once you think about the automation and you plan it out the right way, then that's an alert that is not an interrupt anymore, right? Or you fix the system, you've gone back to the dev team and you've worked and you fix that bug. So it's, like I said, it's a tougher balancing act, but I still think it's doable, right? I still think you can make progress and be successful.
Thanks, Tony. I'll go to Chris and get his thoughts on this.
My thoughts on this is that maybe I look at your question, I'd probably question the question, if you like, when you say, is it right? Are the small companies doing it right? Or is it possible to do it right? What I don't like about the question is the doing it right part, which is there is this whole notion of, hey, look at the Googles, look at the Facebooks, as in some sort of mythical thing that we've all got to like do it that way, or like, no, it doesn't make any sense to me. Like, this company's just maybe a little startup. It's not about, hey, we're doing it wrong because we're not doing it for Google. If they literally took the stuff they did at Google, they would fail, right? Because they just don't have the resources to do that. So it's really about understanding what you do, as we just talked about, right? Understanding what automation makes sense for that company. And really, as we just said, you don't want to have people who are having to do a lot of the, I'll take an example that we have with customers, right? If we have a database that's a horizontally scaled database and a node goes down, I don't want people going in and manually, updating stuff. I want the system to be able to address that, bring it back, update it. So I can get an alert say, yes, something happened, but the system itself took an action, right? So it's about looking at what you do as a company, big or small, medium. What's the right things to look at automation? And it doesn't mean you automate everything. It means what's the right thing for your company with the resources that you've got, and then putting it in order, and then tackling them one by one, or however many you can do with your size of organization, and going from there. But it is not about looking at Google or Facebook and saying they're right and I'm wrong. I think if you start there, then you're in a bad spot.
Thanks, Chris. And the reason for this question was that because a lot of people think that way, and I wanted this to come out. Thanks. But for Nishant and Bala, I'm having a different question. And the question is, how do you see, for Nishant and for Bala, how do you practice bringing all your service providers together as a partner and not as a vendor? Or is it still like vendor? And how will you bring them together? How will you make them work as one team delivering that value or outcome that the organization wants to achieve? So I'll start with Bala and then go to Nishant.
I think it is super challenging, right? I think in simple terms, but I think one of the things which that increases significant complexity is the multi-vendor environment, specifically as various DevOps teams starts to consume various platform services, right? I think from various tiered vendors, right? I think this can quickly create a sprawl, right? I think which we have seen, right? And we have seen quite a number of managed versus unmanaged environments, right? I think which raises our significant security risks, right? I think so. One of the things which we contain is how do we contain the sprawl, right? I think how do we limit the sprawl and contain the damages, right? Coming out of a multi-vendor environment, right? So enterprise architecture has a significant amount of role to play to create a clear blueprint around the managed service offerings coming out of the various vendors, right? I think so that's something which we actively pursue and clearly discover new and put that in play internally so that there can be friction-free internal consumption, right? And then probably they will probably venture out lesser and lesser to a multi-vendor environment, right? I think so. That's one of the ways, but I think there is no single answer to it. It is super challenging, and we need to create probably a layer of abstraction from all this so that we probably are not going to be at the outset clearly multi-vendor dependent, even if it's a multi-cloud vendor or any of the other platform vendors, right? So that's it's not as easy as I say. We all know that it's super challenging, but we have to move incrementally towards that kind of a model.
Thanks, Bala. Yes, Nishant.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Balal. The way I'll answer this question is generally boils down into sort of like having, of course, intent to kind of, make sure that these guys are working well together. But at the same time, it boils down to insights, right? And a common layer of intelligence and a common layer of insights. And I'll give you two examples. In my previous life at Palo Alto Networks, one of the products I used to lead was called Prisma Cloud, and Prisma Cloud is essentially a multi-vendor sort of strategy, and that's why they're successful because every company has Google, Amazon, different cloud vendors, and the idea was that hey, let's build a common sort of visibility layer that sits on top of this, all these multi-vendors, right? And in my current company, I'm doing something similar where I'm like sort of like taking DevOps tools and bringing them together to kind of create a common layer. Now, these tools could be different vendors, could be different sort of service providers, from could be different even contractors or so essentially it's really bringing together the data to even understand how things are working, to understand what sort of like where are we seeing the value, what is the value stream, where are the problems, what are the bottlenecks, and then really making sure that sort of like you have a handle on that, because there'll always be new tools. There'll always be, it's really about how do you make these tools work together, how do you make these vendors work together is really the question that sort of like, it first starts with visibility into all of these different things, and that layer of abstraction or layer of intelligence is what is really needed, to Bala's point. And that's where I've seen this play out in different areas, or different sort of verticals, and but the same similar concept, right? Which is bring this together in one place.
Thanks, Nishant. I think we have crossed a little bit more than the time, and however, we have really got some very good insights from all of you, and I think the participants of DevOps India Summit would be able to get a lot of points to ponder on and try to work on it and implement in their own area. So once again, thanks everyone for your time and for these great insights that you have provided. Thank you.